If you were to ask a person with no prior knowledge of martial arts to associate a single country's culture with unarmed combat, they usually wouldn't say Brazil, Russia, or Thailand. More likely than not, they would say Japan, the land of the rising sun, the country that gave the world sushi, Toyota cars, and, for better or for worse, anime. And this is to be totally expected. Hollywood has long portrayed Japan as a country of esoteric martial arts masters in film franchises like The Karate Kid and franchises like Star Wars, which have been heavily inspired by samurai culture and aesthetics. And some of Japan's best cultural exports, like the Kurosawa samurai films and various shonen anime, are overwhelmingly about martial arts and warrior culture. Popular fighting games made by both Japanese and foreign studios, like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, also have very, very strong Japanese influences. And this representation of Japan as the land for martial arts doesn't stem from nowhere. Modern mixed martial arts and the UFC would not exist if it were not for Japan. The martial art that helped spark the creation of MMA, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was a modification of Kodokan Judo that the Gracie family had learned from Mitsuo Maeda. Sambo, a martial art that was developed by the Soviet Union and is the base for fighters like Islam Makhachev, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Merab Dvalishvili, Magomed Ankalaev, and Fedor Emelianenko, was developed from a combination of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, and Karate with Turkic folk wrestling. Glory Kickboxing, the kickboxing organization that Alex Bahia became a double champion in, is an offshoot of the old K1 kickboxing, which itself is derivative of full contact karate. And Japanese martial arts weren't just influential in the development of modern styles, but are routinely employed to this very day in modern MMA. Stephen Thompson's striking style revolves around the implementation of principles from traditional or Dento-ha karate, which usually does not involve hard sparring. However, Thompson's success in the UFC proved that this style could work at the very highest level in MMA. A Japanese martial art that is even more effective in modern MMA is Judo. Notably, Islam Makhachev has incredible throws and trips, taking down the likes of Charles Oliveira with those techniques. And although Makhachev's Judo techniques are partially a result of his Sambo training, as you can see here, Islam has trained in Judo specifically before, and Khabib himself has spoken about his preference for Judo over freestyle wrestling. Now, I've given you all of this background information because it all leads into this one looming question. If Japan has such a rich background in martial arts, why is there yet to be a Japanese UFC champion? Why has a country which has such storied traditions in hand-to-hand combat failed to win a championship in the world's most prestigious MMA organization? The closest that Japan has had to a champion is Kazushi Sakuraba, who, back in 1997, won the heavyweight tournament at UFC Ultimate Japan by submitting Marcus Silveira. Although this win was impressive when taking into account that Silveira was 27 kilograms, or 60 pounds heavier than the man who would come to be known as the Gracie Hunter, it doesn't change the fact that the win is from when the UFC was back in its infancy. In the modern era of the UFC, numerous Japanese fighters, including Yushin Okami, Kyoji Horiguchi, and most recently Kaya Sakura, have received title shots. But none are yet to succeed. Granted, in most cases they were fighting the ghosts of their divisions like Anderson Silva, Demetrius Johnson, and Alexander Pantoja, but it still doesn't change the fact that Japan still hasn't produced a champion. And furthermore, as of the making of this video in late March of 2025, Japanese fighters are on a 4-fight losing streak in the UFC. The last Japanese fighter to get a win in the UFC was Toshio Kazama in August of 2024. And although he did get a performance bonus for that finish by triangle choke, it was on a card that I'm sure nobody really remembers. Now, there's a reason why I didn't title this video, Why has Japan Failed in the UFC, like I did with my video on India. Unlike India, Japanese fighters aren't doing awfully in the UFC. It's more like Japan has underperformed relative to where you'd expect the country to be. Similar to how you'd expect Kenya Okoye to consistently be getting 10k plus views on his videos, but in reality he gets similar views to what I get despite having 11,000 more subscribers than I do. but I digress. Japan has managed to produce really good fighters that were, or still are, top contenders. Tatsuro Taira might be who comes to mind first for most of you guys. Another notable name is Koji Horiguchi, who left the UFC and went on to become a Bellator champion at bantamweight, despite being a natural flyweight. And Horiguchi is going to be making a return to the UFC in the very near future, with him recently submitting a drug test. And just today, as I was wrapping up making this video, Koji Horiguchi announced at Ryzen 50 that he was relinquishing his Ryzen flyweight title and going to the UFC. So, we have Horiguchi back. Also, while he did get destroyed by Pantoja in his debut, Kaya Sakura still has really good wins outside of the UFC. He's beaten Manel Cape, Juan Archuleta, the aforementioned Koji Horiguchi, and Hiromasa Ogikubo. And Ogikubo, by the way, beat Pantoja on Tough. However, for a country that is so deeply connected to martial arts and contributed so much to MMA through both the development of techniques and the creation of organizations like Pride, Dream, Pancrase, and Shudo, the latter two of which still exist to this very day, Japan is yet to succeed at the highest level of competition in the modern era of mixed martial arts. So today, we will be going through why Japan has struggled so much in the UFC. Now, the disclaimer I have to give here is that I am personally ethnically half Japanese, live in Japan, speak Japanese, and have Japanese citizenship. This means that I am personally invested in this topic, and as a consequence may unknowingly present matters in a way that is favorable to myself and my country. However, because I'm literally from the place I will be talking about, I'm going to have an on-the-ground understanding, which most other MMA YouTubers might not have. But yes, with that lengthy intro out of the way, let's examine why Japan has underperformed in the UFC. Reason 1. Over-specialization. Out of all of the reasons why Japanese fighters tend to fail at the highest level in the UFC, I believe this one is the biggest. If you look at the Japanese fighters who are currently signed to the UFC, you can see that none of them are truly well-rounded. Kaya Sakura is a pure striker. Rei Tsuruya, Renu Nakamura, and Toshio Mikazama are pure grapplers. The Japanese fighter who is closest to being an all-rounder is Tatsuro Taira, which makes sense since he's also the closest to getting the belt. But even he had his striking exposed by Brandon Royval. Now, you don't have to be well-rounded to become a UFC champion. In just the past few years, we saw Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira become all-time greats with calf kicks, jabs, the occasional left hook, and grappling defense. However, being a specialist just isn't going to cut it at any division below welterweight. And since the average height of Japanese men is 171.5 centimeters, or 5'7.5", the vast majority of the athletic talent from Japan is going to be at flyweight and bantamweight. Every champion in the lower weight classes, from Islam to Merab to Pantoja, can strike and grapple at an elite level. Granted, they all have different styles, especially with the striking. You know, with Islam being very defensively responsible with his striking, Merab throwing tons of volume, and Pantoja marching his opponents down because his chin just makes him indestructible. But what they all have in common is that it just works. As Mighty Mouse has said in the past, having a plan B in MMA is probably the most important thing in the sport, and there's countless examples of this being the case. When Volkanovski was getting dropped by Max Holloway in their second fight, Volk was able to use his wrestling to steal the last 3 rounds from Holloway to win the decision. In Merab's title defense against Umar Nurmagomedov, since Umar's wrestling ability was even with his own, it was Merab's volume boxing, and especially his right straight to the body, that helped Merab to win that fight. In the fight between Ilia Topuria and Max Holloway, Ilia Topuria established the threat of the takedown in round 1, which then helped Ilia to get off the overhand right in round 3, which hurt Max. And in Pantoja vs. Moreno 2, it was Pantoja's superior back control, along with his supremely durable chin, that helped him get the decision win. In the lower weight classes, being well-rounded is necessary to becoming a champion. The last specialist who was a champion in the lower weight classes was Sean O'Malley, and he got his title shot with a very controversial win over Petr Yan. And Sean O'Malley won the belt off of an Aljamain Sterling at UFC 292, who had been forced to make a very quick turnaround after UFC 288. Sean then lost the belt to Merab after defending the belt against an undeserving Marlon Vera. With rare exceptions like O'Malley, who was very obviously being given favorable conditions by the UFC, most specialist fighters like Paul Craig and Stephen Thompson tend to be stuck as perennial contenders or gatekeepers. And that's because there's a set game plan to beating them. If you want to beat Paul Craig, you avoid his guard and keep the fight standing. If you want to beat Wonderboy, you pressure him up against the fence so that he can't take his usual bladed stance, and then wrestle him. The same applies to every Japanese fighter currently signed to the UFC. We saw at UFC 313 how Ray Tsuruya had nothing for Joshua Van once Van defended his takedown attempts. Kai Sakura threw everything with 100% power in the first half of the first round against Pantoja in his title fight, and was then controlled and subbed. And with Rinya, well, he just didn't shoot takedowns until he was badly wobbled, so I don't really know what was going on there. And Kai Sakura's coach, Billy Bigelow, has commented on this too. Reacting to Ray Tsuruya's loss at UFC 313, he said, quote, "Tsuruya is having a tough time with his wrestling transitions. He needs to disguise his takedowns with punches. We need to implement better systems into MMA training. It is not enough to be a good striker, wrestler, or grappler. Victories come from transitions and blending of MMA skills. Japan needs to evolve. Let's work together," unquote. And if you look into it, the only active top-level Japanese fighter who is truly well-rounded is Koji Horiguchi. And for those of you who don't know, Horiguchi trains at American Top Team in Florida. Now, why has Japan produced so many specialists in MMA? Well, there isn't a clear-cut answer besides the fact that it's really hard to be a well-rounded MMA fighter at the highest level of the sport. However, if I were to give a couple possible reasons, here they are. First, with the exception of Kai Sakura, the Japanese fighters in the UFC are all grappling specialists. Now, unless a striker has rock-solid takedown defense, it is usually better to pick the grappler to win a fight. So, what you end up getting are these extremely high-level grapplers who bulldoze everybody in the Japanese regional scene with their overwhelming grappling, but then lack experience striking. Second, as Billy Bigelow emphasized in his tweets, there isn't a focus on integrating the different skills of MMA in Japanese gyms, a fact I have to agree with. However, based on training at a gym in Tokyo, I can say that this is rapidly changing. There is a huge emphasis in gyms on cage wrestling, getting up from bottom, and setting up takedowns with boxing offense. However, it also must be said that old habits die hard. And when it comes to who we have to thank for those old habits, it's gotta be Shinya Aoki. Shinya Aoki was one of the biggest stars in Japanese MMA during the 2010s, which is colloquially known in Japan as Kakutogi Fuyu no Jidai, or the winter of Japanese mixed martial arts. I talked about this at length during my video on why Kai Sakura was getting a title shot in his debut, but after the downfall of Pride, the organization that took its place, Dream, just wasn't as popular in Japan. However, during this era of very little hype, one of the few stars in the sport was Shinya Aoki. Aoki, who just fought and probably retired at the Rodtang vs. Takeru 1 championship card, had both a unique fighting style and an interesting personality. To put it bluntly, he was a massive prick, doing stuff like breaking his opponent's arm, sticking his tongue out, and flipping him off, and then prancing around backstage saying, "Ha ha, I broke his arm." Now, this sort of stuff would go completely unpunished in the UFC, but because of this incident, Sengoku Raiden Championships, an MMA organization which was doing cross-promotional fights with Dream, asked for Shinya Aoki to be cut for unsportsmanlike conduct. But since Dream refused to get rid of Aoki, Sengoku stopped collaborating with Dream, leading to a further decline of that organization and Japanese MMA in general. And Japanese MMA was really only truly revived by Kai Asakura's brother Mikuru Asakura, and we'll get to them later. But what I really want to talk about is Shinya Aoki's fighting style. Aoki, throughout his entire career, was a pure grappler, specializing in leg locks, key locks, arm triangles, and rear naked chokes. And he had some pretty great wins throughout his career. You know, heel hooking Eddie Alvarez, getting a decision win over Keo Uno, and winning the ONE FC lightweight championship. However, Aoki achieved all of this without ever really developing his striking. But his grappling game was so far ahead of everybody else that he kept winning. And while he did start taking bad KO losses later on in his career to the likes of Christian Lee and Ben Askren of all people, although that was a TKO loss due to ground and pound, Aoki's style was incredibly influential in Japanese MMA because he was the guy during the 2010s. So, the Japanese approach to MMA developed in isolation for a while, where the meta for the sport was perceived to be grappling with an emphasis on attacks and sweeps from the bottom. And if you were watching that one card, you would have seen this exactly. Aoki got a round 1 submission by jumping guard, pulling his opponent in, and getting an armbar. However, as we all know, with the exception of heavyweight, heel hooks and other attacks from the bottom only work in the UFC as a way to force an opponent on top of you off. And if we're talking about the champions of the lighter weight classes, who are the most skilled, there just is no way that they're getting subbed like that. So, my point is, even though Aoki did define an era of Japanese MMA, and while he is a legend of the sport who has his very own submission named after him, having him be the top dog in Japanese MMA for such a long time may have led to too much of an emphasis on techniques that really don't work in the UFC nowadays. And it also certainly did lead to this notion that a fighter could be successful while only having a ground game. And don't get me wrong, Aoki was a successful fighter, he still is. But he also never fought in the UFC, let alone for a UFC title. But besides the previous acceptance in Japan of pure grappling and offense from the bottom, the other extreme that exists in Japanese MMA are the bunch of pure strikers that transitioned to MMA from Japanese kickboxing. But I'll discuss them in a bit. There's a reason why Kyoji Horiguchi is considered to be the best made-in-Japan fighter, and that's because he can do all the stuff that is needed at the highest level of the sport. He can strike, he can submit, and he can wrestle. And if Japan is going to produce a UFC champion, we're going to need more well-rounded fighters. Reason 2. The talent problem. Why the best combat sports athletes don't choose MMA. One of the biggest challenges that Japanese MMA faces are the limitations on the talent that could go on to become successful in the sport. And although I'm going to go into a long-winded explanation about it later, to condense everything down to a single idea, it's that athletically talented Japanese men are heavily incentivized to go into basically every sport that isn't MMA. And while I did bring this up as an explanation for India's failure in the UFC, in the case of Japan, it's a little bit different, since with India, the athletic talent is going into cricket. In Japan, much of the athletic talent is going into other combat sports, like wrestling, judo, and boxing, which obviously have a lot more in common with MMA. So what I'm saying is, Japan is going to lose more potential MMA talent to other sports than a country like India, since an athlete who's disposed to pursue MMA is also much more likely to become a boxer or a judoka than, let's say, a cricketer is to become a fighter. Japan is the 12th most populous country in the world, with a population of over 120 million, and this gives the country more than enough athletic talent to work with just due to sheer population size. And this is true when looking at Japan's performance in the Olympics, where Japan ranks 10th in the world all time with over 200 gold medals. And Japan has continued to perform well at the Olympics, winning 45 medals at the 2024 Paris Olympics and placing 3rd overall. When it comes to sports, and specifically the Olympics, Japan punches above its weight, which is impressive when considering that, due to the diminishing number of births and the aging of the population, there's going to be less young athletic talent in the first place. However, why then has this athletic talent not transitioned into MMA? Well, it's kind of simple. You can make good money in Japan as an Olympian, and in 99% of cases, you'll be making better money as a successful Olympic athlete than as an MMA fighter. In the US, Olympians are known for getting pretty awful pay. There's stories of Olympic athletes waiting tables, driving Uber, and doing other odd jobs to support themselves. This means that even though you get free meals, a place to sleep, and other basic amenities, being an Olympic athlete isn't that lucrative. However, in Japan, the Japan Olympic Committee, otherwise known as the JOC, pays athletes millions of yen when they win a medal. As you can see here, the JOC pays athletes 5 million yen for gold medals, 2 million yen for silver, and 1 million for bronze. Furthermore, other organizations for the specific sport an Olympian is competing in will pay a bonus on top of that for medals. Add on sponsors, and you can see why it's so much better than taking brain damage in MMA. This incentivizes most Olympians to stay in their respective sports during their athletic primes. I mean, who in their right mind would give up all of that money, along with the prestige of being a multiple-time Olympic medalist, and the amenities that come along with it, for $10,000 to show and $10,000 to win to fight at the UFC Apex? Shinobu Ota, an Olympic silver medalist in Greco-Roman wrestling who transitioned to MMA, has said in the past that he made 25 million yen for winning silver, which is around $170,000. Now, there are countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Turkey that pay much more than that, but what Ota made is still $70,000 more than what Umar Nurmagomedov made for his title fight against Merab at UFC 311. And that, by the way, is publicly available information because the California State Athletic Commission releases those numbers. Now, there's other things besides money that attracts talent to MMA. Ota has said that he wanted to become a rising champion and then a UFC champion one day. But this desire of his was less out of money and more so out of a personal desire to prove himself. But besides those who are driven by factors other than money, there isn't a big incentive for the best Japanese Olympians to compete in MMA. Because why would a lifelong judoka or wrestler pursue MMA when that path pays worse in 99% of cases, requires them to learn extra skills like cage wrestling and striking, may give them CTE, and carries not only much less social prestige, but oftentimes is associated with the criminal underworld? But of course, not everybody is training for the Olympics. There are many young men who specifically want to fight, and by fight, I mean throw hands. But for those men, there is an option which is much more lucrative and carries less of a social stigma, and that is boxing. Due to the prolonged and unparalleled dominance of Naoya Inoue, Japan is currently going through a boxing renaissance. Currently, there are not one, not two, but 3 Japanese fighters, Naoya Inoue, Junto Nakatani, and Kenshiro Teraji, on the Ring Magazine's pound-for-pound list, which makes Japan tied with the US for the most fighters on the list. Japanese fighters are dominating the lower weight classes of boxing right now, clearing out division after division. Just to put Japan's dominance in boxing in perspective, every belt from the 4 major boxing organizations in bantamweight is currently held by a Japanese champion. And of course, Naoya Inoue is the former undisputed bantamweight champion and the current undisputed super bantamweight champion. Inoue himself has said that this is the golden age of Japanese boxing, and this golden age has been brought about in large part because of his dominance. Now, I'm not saying that boxing has taken lots, as in terms of sheer numbers, of the athletic talent that could have gone into MMA, because timeline-wise, that wouldn't make sense. The golden age of Japanese boxing has only been a thing for the past 4 to 5 years, since it was back in 2019 that Naoya Inoue got his first win over Nonito Donaire. However, what has happened is that the best of the best in Japanese talent has chosen to pursue boxing. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about Tenshin Nasukawa. So if you don't follow kickboxing or Japanese martial arts in general, you might not know who Tenshin is. And if you do know him, you might only know him as that kid who cried after getting knocked out by Floyd Mayweather. However, if that's all you know about Tenshin, that'd be a damn shame. And that's because Tenshin is arguably Japan's best combat sports athlete. Tenshin Nasukawa, who started fighting professionally as a kickboxer at 15 years old, has an undefeated pro record in not just kickboxing, but literally every combat sport he has tried. Throughout the entirety of his combat sports career, the only time Tenshin has ever lost as a pro was when he fought Mayweather, and that was an exhibition bout. And even though that was an older Mayweather, Floyd completely outsized Tenshin as well. Now, Tenshin has spent most of his combat sports career as a kickboxer, where he has a record of 42 wins. However, I know that when most people hear the words undefeated world kickboxing champion, they tend to think of the word fraud because of Andrew Tate and his inflated record. However, Tenshin's undefeated record is against anybody but bums. Back in 2016 and 2017, when he was still in high school, he he was beating Thai fighters who were Lumpy Stadium Muay Thai champions, which is one of the most prestigious stadium titles in Thailand. And in 2018, Tenshin beat Rod Tang in kickboxing. Granted, that fight was extremely close, but Tenshin was landing more clean hits. It's just that Rod Tang's chin is just too damn good. And in 2022, during what is widely considered to be the highest level combat sports event in modern Japanese history, the match, Tenshin defeated Takeru, another all-time great in the sport of kickboxing. This led to him being regarded as the best pound-for-pound kickboxer in the world. And by the way, back in 2020, both Takeru and Tenshin were ranked higher than Alex Bahia on kickboxing pound-for-pound lists. However, after defeating Takeru, Tenshin announced a surprising move. He was retiring from kickboxing with the purpose of pursuing boxing instead. So, instead of transitioning to MMA like Alex Bahia did, Tenshin decided to ride the wave created by Naoya Inoue and Junto Nakatani and pursue the sweet science. Just imagine what Tenshin could have done if he had done something like sign with the UFC. He would undoubtedly be the best pure striker at flyweight. But you might be wondering at this point, didn't you say that you can't be a specialist like Alex Bahia at the UFC's lower weight classes? Well, the thing is, Tenshin has already fought in MMA 4 times. And granted, 3 of those fights were against complete cans. But one of those wins was by submission. Even though Tenshin would have had to work a lot on his grappling to make the transition to MMA, he is by no means a complete novice. And he is still only 26 while being supremely talented. However, now that he's a boxer, it's unlikely we will ever see him back in Rizin, let alone in the UFC. So yeah, Japan is doing better in other combat sports, so the literal best talent the country has to offer is pursuing that instead. Reason 3. The existence of Rizin, and what success means for a Japanese fighter. So now we can finally discuss what I tend to believe is a crucial difference in the mentality and motivations of Japanese fighters versus those of fighters from the rest of the world. Beginning with non-Japanese fighters, their goal is very clear. Win on the regional scene, get signed to the UFC, and become a champion. This is true regardless of whether you're an American, a Dagestani, a Nigerian, a Kiwi, or Chinese. But in Japan, it's a little bit different. Japanese MMA is probably the most isolated MMA scene there is, with completely different expectations from both fighters and fans. First off, the definition of what constitutes a casual versus a hardcore fan is reversed in Japan as opposed to the wider world. With the global MMA fanbase, casuals follow the UFC and only the UFC, and hardcore fans follow smaller promotions like PFL, Bellator when it existed, ONE, KSW, Octagon, and Rizin. But in Japan, hardcore fans, who are referred to as Kakutogi Otaku, or Kakuota, are the only fans who follow the UFC. Casual fans in Japan have no idea who someone like Tom Aspinall, or Jack Della Maddalena, or Hanato Moicano is. And many of them had no idea who Pantoja was until Kai Asakura was gifted a title shot against him. Most casual Japanese fans probably know the following non-Japanese UFC fighters: Conor McGregor, Khabib, Pantoja because he beat Kai Asakura, Mighty Mouse because he beat Koji Horiguchi, Brandon Royval because he beat Taira, Strickland because he sparred Rukia Ampo during his trip to Japan, and maybe John Jones, GSP, and Anderson Silva, if they're on the older side. In fact, Japanese fighters are more likely to know names from Bellator, like the Pitbull brothers and AJ McKee, than they are to know UFC fighters because of the Bellator vs. Rising crossover cards. I also said this in my video about Kai Asakura making his UFC debut, but Japanese fans know that the UFC has the highest level of MMA in the world. They just couldn't care less. And that's because there are very few incentives for Japanese fighters to fight outside of Rizin. Now, let me explain why that's the case. The reason why every non-Japanese MMA fighter's goal is to fight in the UFC is because the UFC, whether you like it or not, is the only organization that can pay fighters a decent wage. Now, before Luke Thomas gets on my ass and whines about fighter pay, I said can, not does. I know most fighters get 10K to show and 10K to win or thereabouts as a starting contract, but it's still more than PFL and 1. And if you're able to stay in the UFC for long enough, you can end up making 6 figures on a consistent basis. The reason why the UFC is able to keep wages suppressed while also paying the best out of any organization is because the UFC basically enjoys a monopoly. Other organizations simply cannot afford to pay as much. And when they do, like the PFL did with Francis Ngannou, they risk bankrupting themselves. Just to demonstrate what I mean, Adriano Moraes, a former ONE FC flyweight champion, the guy who knocked out Demetrius Johnson, was making less than Mackenzie Dern. So, the best talent from these non-UFC organizations like Renier de Ridder and Patricio Pitbull ends up at the UFC in the end. However, in the case of Rizin, this is different. Because the UFC hasn't managed to break into Japan, Rizin has been able to maintain its dominance over the market. As a result, Rizin is one of the few MMA organizations besides the UFC that has net positive cash flow by itself, which allows Rizin to pay both its stars and its undercard fighters decently. Back in 2022, Mikuru Asakura, who is Kai Asakura's older brother and an even bigger star than Kai, said that his fight purse for a single fight was over 100 million yen, which would have been around $880,000 in 2022 exchange rates. That's more than what Volkanovski was reported as making for his fight against Ilia Topuria back at UFC 298. And even if we're going by today's exchange rate, Mikuru would be making more than Merab's disclosed purse at UFC 311. Of course, the undercard fighters won't be paid nearly as much. According to what I've seen, fighters who are making their Rizin debut can expect to make around 1 million yen, or $6,600 give or take. But, in addition to that money, Rizin also allows fighters to have their own sponsors. That means they can make a few thousand extra dollars. And being able to fight in Rizin gives fighters a platform to build their own personal brands as fighters. Due to Rizin events happening much less often than UFC events, these undercard fighters rapidly become recognizable and are able to acquire their own smaller fan bases. And once a fighter has a fan base, he or she can start building a social media following, especially on monetizable platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and X, from where they can start pursuing the path to stardom. And that is why if you ask a debuting Japanese fighter with an 0-0 record what his goal is, he'll probably say, "I want to fight in Rizin." And here's the thing. Building that big Japanese fan base is the true path to success in Japanese MMA. The biggest star in Japan, and therefore the man with the biggest purse, isn't Tatsuro Taira, a top-ranked UFC contender. It's not even Koji Horiguchi, a champion in Rizin and Bellator, who is widely recognized as the greatest modern Japanese fighter. It's Mikuru Asakura, who didn't even become a Rizin champion, but managed to build a huge YouTube channel and repopularize MMA. And that's what it all comes down to. In Japanese MMA, you don't have to be the best fighter to be the biggest draw. You just need to be popular, whether that be because you have a fun fight style, a fun personality, or whatever other possible reason. Now, let me demonstrate that with a few real examples. Currently, there is an event scheduled for May 4th, 2025 at the Tokyo Dome called Rizin Otokomatsuri, which translates to Rizin Man Festival.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, besides Peyton Talbot and Jeff Molina obviously wanting to attend this event, what's really indicative of what Japanese fans want can be seen from the two big fights that have been used to market this card. First, there's the Rizin featherweight title match, which is between Kleber Koike Herbst and Razbali Shaydulayev. This fight is probably one of the highest level fights that is taking place this year outside of the UFC. Kleber is 34-7, and in addition to being a current Rizin champion, is a former KSW champion as well. Meanwhile, Razbali Shaydulayev is one of the most exciting prospects in MMA. He's literally the second coming of Shavkat Rakhmonov, undefeated with all of his 12 wins coming by finish. Kleber versus Shaydulayev is undoubtedly a UFC caliber match. What, then, is the other fight that's being used to market this card? What other fight will help sell out this event that is taking place at the Tokyo Dome, which seats 50,000 people? It's a flyweight bout between Hiroya Kondo versus Tatsuki Shinotsuka. Hiroya has a record of 10-13, while Shinotsuka is making his professional MMA debut. Granted, Shinotsuka is a kickboxer who is a former crushed featherweight champion, and has fought in Rizin under kickboxing and bare-knuckle boxing rules. But this fight between Hiroya and Shinotsuka is being used as a key piece of the promotional material for this card. So, why is that? It's because both of these guys are draws in Japanese MMA. And that is because Hiroya trains at Japan Top Team along with Mikuru and Kai Asakura, while Shinotsuka trains at the Gokikai, the karate dojo that Ren Hiramoto, a big star in Japan who KO'd Mikuru Asakura, belongs to. In the world of Japanese MMA, you don't need to have a pretty record or fantastic skills. Those help, but you can make it into Rizin and have a successful career as a mixed martial artist by being an entertaining personality, having a fun fight style, or having the right connections. The best example of this I can think of is the aforementioned Ren Hiramoto. Hiramoto is a former K1 kickboxer, but he wasn't a champion or anything, and his professional MMA record sits at 4-3, with his only win by finish being against Mikuru Asakura. However, he has marketed himself as a heel on social media and has done such a good job that he is now the second biggest star in Japanese MMA, right behind Mikuru Asakura himself. And while Ren Hiramoto has said that he wants to become the next Conor McGregor and eventually fight in the UFC and become champion there, I have to wonder, would Ren be willing to sacrifice the money that he is making in Japan for a chance at the UFC? Sure, Kai Asakura was apparently signed to an extremely good contract, but that's because Kai Asakura had built up an impressive resume outside of the UFC, and him becoming a champion was seen as the key to opening up the Japanese market. Would Ren Hiramoto, with his record of 4-3, with one of those losses coming by way of TKO against Kyohei Hagiwara, who is currently 7-10, be seen in the same way as Kai Asakura? I doubt it. And as a consequence, I think that the careers of most Japanese stars will conclude inside of Japan. Which then brings me back to the title of this section: what success means for a Japanese fighter. As opposed to fighters from the rest of the world, who must pursue the UFC at all costs, Japanese fighters can try to become established stars domestically. In order to be successful in the UFC, you must have a fantastic record, impeccable fighting skills, and dedicate yourself to MMA in a way that is obsessive and oftentimes mentally unhealthy. But if you're a Japanese star pursuing domestic stardom, you're going to need other strengths: the ability to market yourself, the appeal of your personality, and a solid social media presence. And oftentimes, being a domestic star is not just more achievable, but more lucrative in the end. Anyways, that is the end of the video. Please like, share, and sub if you enjoyed it. Goodbye.